mainstream opposition of any sort at all. And here, the lesson of Latin America is very clear. We have to learn from it, and we have to try and recreate it in different parts of the world. And the fact that one can say this in the year 2006 shows how much the world has changed from what it was in the late 90s. Thank you.
Now we can have some questions, and I'm going to ask of you a favor, which might be kind of funny, but if you can use this mic, when you ask the question, I'll pass it around.
No, it's a television mic.
It's not a mic that we will hear, but it'll help our cameras.
Well, or I can, yeah, if you've got a mic, or I could repeat the question if you want. Can I urge you to, stick to questions, because if you start making speeches, we'll be here all night. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for coming out. I feel like this is one of the few places in Washington, D.C. where left-wing people can be a little safe. Thanks so much for coming out. And I was wondering, you talk about solidarity and building in tandem with these movements going on all over the world and down in South America especially. And as a veteran of the 60s and the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, I'm actually quite curious on what you have to say about steps towards that, especially because we've also experienced a seismic shift over the summer with the immigrant rights movement, the first time May Day was celebrated in this country. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what you have to say about it.
Well, look, we're in a very different period from the 60s and 70s. The 60s and 70s were periods, you could say it was an epoch of, we were still in an epoch of revolutionary change. The triumph of capital in the 1990s has been very profound. One shouldn't underestimate that. The victory of capital globally, the fact that private capital entered Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was transformed, that the most dynamic capitalist country in the world today is China, which is the workshop of the world, more or less. When 9/11 happens and American industry is incapable of producing enough flags in time to sell them, they go to China. And the Chinese factories produce these flags and ship them over. So that is the workshop of the world today, China. Now, what this means, and also if you look at the picture globally, you have the United States as the dominant imperial power, unchallenged militarily by anyone. No one can challenge it militarily. The weaponry it has, it could destroy the whole world. And people don't like to challenge it militarily either. That is the case. Its economy is weak, as we know, very heavily dependent on debt, and very closely interlinked now to the Far Eastern economies. They're very dependent on each other. There is a linkage. But in terms of political opposition, none of the big centers of global capital, neither the European Union, nor the Far Eastern sector, nor Russia, oppose the United States politically. They might secretly do something or the other or express, but publicly they go along with them in most things. That has been the case since the late 90s. The Iraq War brought about a tiny shift when the Germans and the French refused to support the war, and the Russians and the Chinese said, we are not going to support this particular adventure. And of course, they were proved right. But immediately after that, the French collaborated with the Americans in occupying Haiti, removing Aristide from power, an elected leader. The Germans voted, they were then on the Security Council, for the retrospective resolution justifying the occupation and accepting it. So there is no big political opposition coming.
I would would like to get your opinion on the opposition candidate, Manuel Rosales, in the next election in December in Venezuela, and also whose camp says that every time that Bush or Rice opens their mouth, Chavez goes up in the polls.
Well, if that's what Rosales' camp has said, that is a bit worrying because it means they're getting more intelligent. But it's, you know, I mean, they were thinking of boycotting the election for ages because they were so demoralized. And they felt that the way to show that Chavez is an authoritarian is not to put up candidates against him, and then you can pretend, well, look, no one stood against him, he's not really elected. And then they realized this would be a very stupid thing to do because, you know, no one would take them too seriously. So, in fact, they decided to put up a candidate, which is good, fine, we will have a political battle. And we will see. But I think if that's what he's saying, asking Bush and Condi Rice not to interfere in Venezuelan politics, that's a small step forward. Because his predecessors, the politicians of the oligarchy in that country in the past were constantly pleading with the United States to intervene. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Hi, my question has to do with Iraq, actually, and Afghanistan. Because the United States and the CIA during the 60s, 70s with Hussein crushed the left, crushed labor movements, progressive movements, it's interesting, it seems that the objective anti-imperialist efforts are coming from more religious fundamental forces. And I'm curious how you see that playing out. You talked about the lack of a social vision, but with the objective anti-imperialist forces coming from these religious fundamentalist groups, because the left was crushed at the behest of the United States largely in many of these countries, in Afghanistan and in Iraq. How do you see that moving forward with your knowledge of how national liberation movements develop and that kind of thing? Thank you.
Well, there is no single answer to this question because the movements which are fighting back against occupation are different in different parts of the world. In Afghanistan, the main opposition comes from former remnants of the Taliban. Backed by new supporters they have won over since the country was occupied, and there is very little actual information about the composition of the groups now fighting in Afghanistan, where the fighting is increasing. The United States, and certainly the puppet leader in Kabul, Hamid Karzai, alleges that the Pakistani government is giving support to these groups, which may or may not be true. I have no information on that. But it wouldn't totally surprise me if they were, because what's become very obvious that the NATO occupation of Afghanistan is yet another disaster. And they won't be able to stay there for too long. And so the Pakistani government could be thinking, we better get our act together because we might be needed again to go and take the country like we did in the 90s. So it's a messy situation in Afghanistan. In Iraq, the resistance by and large has been led by former units of the Iraqi army who knew that Saddam Hussein would not be able to resist, and who 6 weeks before the invasion did something very intelligent. They disbanded. They built arms dumps, different parts of Iraq where their strength was, and they told soldiers and junior officers, you go back into these areas, take off your military uniform, and prepare to fight, because our leadership is it's incapable of fighting, but we have to defend our country. And they did it. That's how it started. Because if you look at it, the resistance was extremely effective 2 weeks after the occupation of Baghdad. It didn't take long for it to start, and if you compare that to the resistance in Europe against the Germans during the Second World War, it took 2 to 3 years to start in most of the European countries. In Iraq, it took 2 weeks because these units existed. They were trained, they knew how to use weapons, and they had stored enough weapons and military and built armed dump all of the kind. The United States has now admitted this. What I'm saying is not a secret because they found out that's how it started. Subsequently, religious organizations developed because there was nothing left, and the United States decided to ban the old Baath Party. Or most of the existing parties which were allowed to function were collaborating with them. So the opposition went to, in the hands of the dominant areas of middle Iraq, to the Sunni groups. The Association of Sunni Scholars, who are not extremists in that sense, they are pretty moderate in many of their statements, then joined in the resistance, and then you had a big upsurge amongst the poorer sections of the population who were led and influenced by the Shia group of Muqtada al-Sadr, and at one point it looked as he would link up with the other resistance, and if that had happened, the occupation would have ended a few years ago, but enormous pressure was put on him not to do it. But that situation is virtually at an end now, because as the United States is openly discussing the rapid phased withdrawal, that's being discussed by the Pentagon. There's no two ways about it. If you look at the New York Times every day, it's reported in different ways. If they do that, then I think it's the mess they've created in Iraq is so big that there is a danger, there's a danger anyway, of a split taking place in the country in basically three regions emerging. The Kurdish region, which will be an Israeli-American protectorate like Jordan, middle Iraq, which will probably be led by former remnants of the army and the Sunnis, and the rest of the large bulk of the country will be under the control of the Shia groups and will make Iran the strongest regional player in that part of the world. This is ironically what the occupation of Iraq by the United States has led to. As far as the left in Iraq is concerned, it doesn't exist. The tiny Iraqi Communist Party used to be the strongest party in that part of the world, but this is a party which collapsed a long time ago, largely due to repression from its rivals, and then made a big mistake to join the collaborationist regime, which it lost all credibility completely. So that is the situation there. But how these groups, different groups, evolve, we don't know. They might evolve beyond all this. When they are forced to run these countries, then I think we will see some debates. For instance, the last presidential election which took place in Iran between Rafsanjani and Ahmadinejad, religion was never mentioned, because both were Muslims, both came from the same sort of dominant faction of clerics. No one discussed religion. What was discussed was the condition of the poor in Iran. And Ahmadinejad said, I will try and do something for the poor. And his big weapon in the election campaign was a special video which showed Rafsanjani, his opponent's lifestyle, and the wealth he had accrued while he had been in power. So, ironically, the last Iranian presidential election was the only recent election, compared to the West certainly, where class was discussed endlessly. In whose interest should Iran be run? And Rafsanjani hired a U.S. public relations agency which came and orchestrated his campaign. So he had, rah-rah girls wearing the hijab and dancing in the streets of Tehran, just mimicking how the West organizes its campaign, and it backfired. He didn't win. But the reason he didn't win was not because Ahmadinejad was a fanatical religion, it wasn't mentioned. It's because Ahmadinejad is known to be totally honest and incorruptible, which is a big thing in that world. And secondly, because he said, I will try and do something for the poor. Thirdly, probably because he built a statue of Bolivar in Tehran, but we shouldn't talk about that too much. Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for this front page with like a hell of fire there, and then a heaven with an angel, with a Cuban angel. There is this. It's very cool. So, well, it's